Welcome to the Cultivation Cast by Black Dog LED with Kevin and Noah. In this podcast series, we will cover all things related to indoor cannabis cultivation. Hey everybody, welcome back today. We're here for the Cultivation Cast with Noah and Kevin. Today we're going to cover something that's come up recently in some of our calls, which is as you get into commercial, one of the major things you want to do in a commercial grow is really worry about risk mitigation and what do you do. At home, if you lose a crop, that's a bad thing. But if you lose a crop in a commercial grow, you can lose your business. And so what we wanted to talk about today was what can go wrong and what you can do about it, both proactively and then after the fact when you run into it.
And of course, all of these things apply for home growers as well. There's absolutely nothing different other than the scale of what's going on.
Yeah, the difference is you can pick up and move on from a couple plant loss, but if you lose a grow, we've seen actual grows go out of business from losing a large grow if they didn't mitigate risk.
And for really stupid reasons as well.
We've heard some pretty stupid reasons to lose a grow, that's for sure. So let's talk about the highest level of risk mitigation there is, and that's just compartmentalizing things. That seems simple, but it's not. And we run into people that come to us with a commercial grow facility where they've got one giant flower room and one veg room. And that might seem efficient. And from a space utilization standpoint, it kind of is. You're not wasting space with walls and extra aisles. However, if you have an outbreak, you're going to lose your entire flower room potentially, whether it's bugs or a virus or anything along those lines. So one of the first things we try to do with the customer is look at what their setup is and say, look, if you've got one giant flower room, let's break this up. There are other reasons that we're not going to cover today having to do with business needs, balancing your workflow, your labor load so that you can keep people working all the time, why you'd want to break those rooms up. But we're going to focus today on more of the risk mitigation side, which is if you have a breakout in one flower room, you're in trouble. If we have multiple flower rooms, you can quarantine that bad room and hopefully save your other rooms and not get whatever that pathogen or pest was into your other rooms. So that's number one. That's the most basic thing you can do. That's a simple high-level thing. But now let's get into the more detailed stuff of things that can go wrong. So you've got to grow. We all know you're depending on environment. You're depending on your grower's skill. You're depending on a lot of things for your operation to run smoothly. But Kevin, what are some of the most common things that we can plan on happening in a grow? Now, there's a lot of unknowns that we'll never plan on. You and I we get broadsided with problems in a grow sometimes. Still, that's the joy of gardens is that you never stop learning. However, there's some that we run into regularly. What are some of the biggest problems that we see that you should plan for and maybe try to mitigate early on?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most common is simple electrical disruption, losing your electricity to your building. And it can be from an electrical storm, a lightning storm. It can be from a windstorm, backhoes, people driving into power poles. There's all sorts of reasons why people lose electrical service to their grow. And a lot of people assume that you need, if you really want to have a plan for handling that you need this massive generator system, for example, so you can keep all of your lights on. But it turns out, in terms of risk mitigation and keeping your plants from dying on you, you don't need to do that much. There are a few critical things, but for example, people are often concerned about keeping lights on over their plants in flower. And the truth is that cannabis is a day-length sensitive plant. It goes into flower when it sees 12 hours of darkness per day. If it sees 18 or 24 hours of darkness, that's not going to make it revert back to vegetative growth. It's just losing out on a day's worth of photons and 8 days worth of growth. And you're basically just giving the plant an extra day of sleep if you don't turn the lights on. Now, in vegetative growth, it's very important so your plants don't start flowering that they do have an interrupted night period. That doesn't mean you have to have all of the lights on in veg, and it doesn't mean you have to have all of the lights on in veg for 18 hours a day. Simply turning the lights on in veg temporarily for even 5 minutes at 8-hour intervals will keep the plants from going to flower because they're not getting that 12 hours of uninterrupted darkness.
So, Kevin, I know there's no hard and fast research on this, but if you had to fathom a guess, and we know from light tests that it's going to be different from cultivar or phenotype to phenotype, what do you think would be enough? Because we're lighting guys, what would be enough par to make sure that the plants are awake in a room, if you wanted to use that?
100 ppfd is enough to keep the plants awake. We've seen that in commercial greenhouses. 100 ppfd is not very much light at all. That's basically what you're using when you're trying to do cloning, and clearly it keeps the clones awake and prevents them from going into flowering. So that's really all you need. And if you've got a giant veg room with 50 lights in it, you don't need to have all 50 lights on at once to get that light level. In fact, you might be able to turn on 5 of the lights in the room and get plenty of light. If you can turn them 5 out of the 50 on for just 5 minutes, that's all it takes to wake those plants back up, disrupt that hormone cycle, and prevent them from going into flower.
That's interesting. So if I use the calculator that you put up on our site that allows us to look at the PPFD, or the intensity of our lights over any area, and if you want to see this, by the way, you can go to our site, go to blackdogled.com/calculator, and you will have the calculators there. But I'm using the one for hanging height, and if you put our 1,000 over 12 by 12, which is 144 square feet, it will still provide 111 U-moles. So at that point, you can cover, with one of our lights, you could theoretically, Kevin, right, wake up an entire veg area that's 144 square feet with one of our thousands.
Yes, and it doesn't need to be running continuously. It can be running for 5 minutes. So if you only have enough emergency power to run a light in your veg, only one light at a time, just turn one light on at a time, and it doesn't take very much time. I've even known people that have gone in with flashlights. And if you aim a flashlight at the plant for long enough, for 5 minutes or so, that's enough to wake it up. So if you don't have a generator, typically you probably still have a battery-powered flashlight somewhere that you can use if you're desperate to keep your plants from going into flower. And of course, it's also not the end of the world if the plants in veg suddenly get 24, 36 hours, 48 hours of complete darkness. That will initiate the flowering hormones within them. However, once you resume a normal light cycle, once you actually have the electricity back, they will normally revert back to vegetative growth fairly quickly. It will slow down their vegetative growth. It will kind of stunt them a little bit, but it's not an emergency situation where you're going to lose a crop if your vegetative plants see 36 or 48 hours of darkness.
Got it. So we love the science. We love real world. So part of the reason we're having this discussion is we had a call the other day with one of our customers in Hawaii, and he was looking at trying to use smaller lights because they do have power outages in Hawaii, and he was wanting to be able to turn one light on because he was smart enough to know he didn't need all the power, but he didn't realize that he didn't need to do that in flower. So he was trying to keep his flower crop and worrying about a day or two of power outage while they fix the power in Hawaii. And I explained to him, look, that's not something to worry about. You should worry about your veg, as Kevin was saying, but your flower, just let it go. Now, granted, you don't want a week of darkness necessarily because that will affect yields, but a day or two is going to be almost immeasurable over the period of a flower cycle.
Well, and I can tell you exactly what happens when plants get extended dark periods. They continue to grow, but the new leaves will come out without a full complement of chlorophyll. They look very yellow, pale yellow, and that's not lack of nutrients. It's not anything other than lack of light. And basically, the chloroplasts in those new leaves have not been exercised. They've not been forced to create more chlorophyll. And so they come out looking very yellow. They can be tender. When the lights do come back on, they can get a little bit shocked there. And the leaves can even demonstrate some signs of light burn when the lights do come back on, depending on exactly how long they've been in the dark. But I can tell you, I've had plants shipped to me through the mail that have spent more than a week in a cardboard box getting no light whatsoever. And yes, it takes them a couple of days to recover once you get them out of that box, but they do just fine. This is something that people do all the time. Plants get shipped through the mail and they do just fine. So losing light is not necessarily a problem, but there are other big considerations depending on how you're growing if your electricity goes out.
Now, I would like to point out that you should follow all of your local laws. Kevin is a plant nut and plant nerd, and he's talking about tropical plants and things like that, not shipping cannabis through the mail. We recommend not necessarily shipping cannabis through the mail, even if it's hemp. There's still a bit of a gray area there. So just to be clear, Kevin is not talking about shipping cannabis plants through the mail right now.
No, but it's amazing. You can order, and I have ordered 6-7 foot tall trees through the mail, and they get crammed in a little box. And if you know how to package things up properly, you can actually send impressive plants through the mail.
Yeah, for sure. So that's power, right? So that's obviously, as lighting guys, that's one of the things most near and dear to our heart, right?
So exactly. And if you lose power, the lighting isn't what you need to worry about. If you're growing hydroponically and you lose power, you've got serious concerns that you need to start considering immediately, because if you don't have the pump providing that mist to your plant's roots, if you're running aeroponics, your plants can die within an hour. If you don't have the pump controlling your ebb and flow system that's doing it every other hour, if it's not able to hit one of those, your plants can dry out and die in just a matter of a couple of hours. So if you're running hydroponic, there is where, if you have a backup generator, that's where the power should be going, is going to those pumps, making sure that you're keeping the roots wet and keeping those plants from drying out, because they will die much, much faster from their roots drying out than lack of light. Now, if you're growing in soil and the plants have enough water, then you're fine there. But in hydroponics, you're generally very dependent on some sort of electrical supply to ensure your plants are staying alive. And that's where a manual pump or even just using buckets can be done to move water from one reservoir up to your tray and back down again. There's all sorts of clever things you can do depending on your exact setup, but that's what you really should be worried about. Number 3, when you lose electrical power, you're going to lose your HVAC and your air circulation. Now, a couple hours of air circulation being lost is not necessarily a problem, but if you're losing air circulation in a room and dehumidification in a large room for a period of 24 to 48 hours, that can be enough time for humidity to condense out on the leaves and start growing mold. That is definitely a problem as well. So you want to make sure that you're keeping track of the humidity and air movement in the room so you don't end up with stagnant air spots that are going to start growing mold on you.
So now this is where understanding the problem, truly not just that you're growing cannabis, but the environment you're in. So where you're located physically can make a huge difference in some of the considerations we're talking about. If you're in Alaska and the power goes out in the winter, I'm imagining you're going to have some concerns about freezing your entire grow. I'm born and raised in Phoenix, and I can tell you this, that if you had a grow there in the middle of the summer, even if all your lights are off and you lose power, there's a good chance you're going to fry your plants quickly. So again, it depends, and this is where you as the grower have to step back, or as the facility manager, and say, I understand I'm in a particularly hot or cold environment. What are the challenges that's going to impose upon me in these emergency situations? Yeah, you should know that you're going to need more HVAC in Phoenix than you're going to need up in Alaska, of course. But also, you might think of that in a day-to-day, but you need to step back and look at that in these emergency situations. How do you deal with those issues?
But it's also important not to overreact there either, because, for example, we've had people that are very concerned about maintaining their HVAC, their air conditioning, when the lights are off if there's a power failure. And to some extent, that is a concern. However, one of the reasons that plants are temperature sensitive during the daytime is because their leaves are being bombarded by all this light, and the light is heating up the leaves of the plant itself. If you no longer have the light hitting the plant's leaves, while it's not ideal for the plant, most cannabis plants can tolerate 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the dark, and they may sulk, they may wilt, but they're not going to die like they would if the lights were on. Especially high-pressure sodium lights would kill plants at that temperature. But in the dark, they can actually tolerate it. So if the power goes out and your room gets up to 100 degrees, you're probably still fine. Now, if it gets up to 120 degrees, you're really starting to stress the plants there. But again, if you can maintain any sort of air movement in there, whether it's going in with a large box and waving it around to help move air around, or if the plants are starting to wilt because it's simply too warm, spraying water to increase humidity can help with that. But again, you don't want stagnant air. You don't want the water sitting on the leaves full time, because that can potentially cause mold issues. So this is something where if you're used to losing power for an hour or two at a time, it's probably not a concern at all with your HVAC. However, if you lose power for 48 hours, you might have a serious issue that you need to consider. And like Noah said, it depends on where in the country you are. If you're up in Alaska in the middle of winter, it would probably be a very good idea to have a large barrel full of water somewhere that you can have, because water actually stores and releases heat much longer and much slower than most other substances. It's actually even better than concrete at storing heat. And so one of the easiest, simplest insurance policies you can have against a room freezing quickly is fill it full of water. Even if that water is relatively cold, it takes a lot of heat energy flowing out of that room to actually finally freeze that water, and it can keep your plants from freezing. So if you're in a cold area and you lose electrical, it's not important to maintain the plants at 75, 85 degrees. What you want to make sure and do is maintain the plants above 32 degrees. You want to keep them from freezing. As long as you keep them from freezing, they may sulk, they may slow down their growth for a couple days when you get electricity back, but they will be fine. As long as they don't freeze, they will be fine.
Yeah, we've seen plenty of cannabis plants bounce back from being smothered by snow, and they're just fine when they come back the next day. Sometimes they don't get quite as tall again, but they definitely bounce back. So it's a nice, resilient plant. So that's power loss. So we've got light concerns, which is our top concern as lighting guys. Then you've got the environmental concerns, as Kevin's saying, humidity and temperature, that you've got to worry about during a power outage. So let's talk about other things that could go wrong. You know, we did power. There are other ones that I want to cover, but let's speak real quickly, because you're talking about hydroponics, and we all know light is one of the necessities for our plants, whether, you know, it's a light cycle or not. The other one is water. So let's say you have a water outage and you've got to get water. You know, there's not a lot you can do here. You can always ship it in and that, but you should have some kind of plan. What do you do? In this, I want to be clear, there's a couple different forms this can take. If you have one giant water holding tank for all your fresh water and you can fill that every day and that gives you enough water for that day, I'm not even just talking about a water outage. What happens if some contaminant gets in there and that water turns? You come in one day and there's stuff growing in your water holding tank and you only had one water holding tank. Now, if you can't produce water quick enough through your RO system or something, you're in trouble for production, and plants aren't going to just wait an extra day to get watered. That's not the way they work. So in that case, one of your mitigations is to just have another tank. What are some of the other things we can do there, Kevin, to try and eliminate that problem or mitigate it? So
plants need water, light, and carbon dioxide and nutrients all in equal balance. If you can't supply one of them, you don't want to continue supplying all of the rest and trying to keep the plant growing, because it's going to increase its needs. So, for example, if you were unable to water your plants, the first thing I would do is shut off the lights. If you have dehumidification systems, I would set those to a much higher humidity level, allow higher humidity level in the room. Again, you don't want to maintain that for 24 to 48 hours. That might cause a problem, but for 12 hours, it's not going to cause a problem. And that can help you limp through. If you're physically unable to water your plants, turn off the light, stop making them want more water that way, and then let the humidity creep up in the room. If you've got a plant which is drought stressing and you physically can't water it for whatever reason, you've only got 1/4 cup of water to your name, you're actually better off spraying that on the plant's leaves than dumping it on the plant's roots. It's more quickly taken up through the leaves, and it will actually help reduce evaporation through the leaves for a little while, where just dumping that on the roots, it takes a lot longer to get into the plant. Now, obviously, it would be best off to water the plant, but if you don't have the water, and you've only got just a little bit, it's actually better to spray it on the plant's leaves to help stretch out the period of time before you can get more water on them.
So with the water issue, number one, like we said with the flower rooms, you can have problems in flower rooms, but we can mitigate that risk by breaking your facility up into multiple. And so we work with customers on designing a facility or trying to set up a facility with water. We will often stay right up front that we want to have at least 2 water holding tanks, so that if one goes bad, you can limp through no problem. You're kind of, again, it's just that mitigating that risk. And then as Kevin said, if you don't have that and you have a water problem, there are some things you can do to the environment to adjust to allow your time, to extend your time you can survive out further. And then also, if you have limited water, as Kevin was saying, you can definitely apply it differently and get it to go as far as possible.
And of course, besides turning off lights, I would also turn off airflow in the room at least most of the time. Again, you want to stir up the air now and then, but you don't necessarily need to have fans blowing dry air on your plants if you can't water them. So that's where I would turn off any oscillating fans in the area, any recirculating fans. and then turn those on just briefly every 12 hours until you can get water.
All right. So that's water.
Nutrients. People run out of nutrients all the time. Watering your plants on Friday night, it's 11 o'clock, all the hydro shops are closed, and you realize, oh, I ran out of that nutrient. So if you ran out of one part of a 12-part mix, it really kind of depends on what that 12-part mix was and what part you ran out of. If you've got a base nutrient, you're supposed to be mixing parts A and B, and you're out of part B, you're probably better off giving the plants plain water at that point than watering them with partial fertilizer, because you can get those base nutrients really out of whack very quickly and cause nutrient deficiencies and at the same time overabundance of other nutrients within the plant. It's always better to keep everything balanced. So if you're out of fertilizer on the base nutrient parts, simply water with plain water instead. Get more fertilizer, water them with fertilizer the next day. If it's one of these additives, if it's a silicon additive, if it's some sort of bloom boosting additive, yeah, you can probably mix up your fertilizer like normal and just skip that part, add it back in next time. But if it's part of your base nutrient solution, you definitely don't want to do a half-assed job on that. If you can't provide all of the fertilizer, then just water them with regular water.
Keep in mind, with all these solutions we're giving you, the goal is to not exacerbate the problem. You're in triage mode. You've got a problem in your grow, whether it's a power problem or a water problem or a nutrient problem. We don't want to do something that's going to cause you long-term problems. And as Kevin is saying, if you left one of those important ones out, you could create a lockout issue that's going to you're going to be chasing that for a lot longer than your problem's going to last. So don't make the problem worse, and listen to his advice there with regard to those nutrients. That's one of the things I was going to ask you, is also to point out, if they are hitting with plain water, we would recommend still pHing the plain water so that they don't shock the roots in between waterings with that. So if you're used to pHing water and you're following a standard pH, you could still at least just pH that plain water before you put it on there, just to make sure it's not out. But again, knowing your own water source would make a big difference on that.
Yeah, and I think one of the more important things to realize is if you're using reverse osmosis water, distilled water, some sort of ultra-purified water, that water is so pure that when you water plants' roots with it, it can literally suck nutrients out of the roots and into the water, back into the soil, and suck nutrients out of the plant's roots. So you're better off watering with something dissolved in that water, whether it's an acid or a base to adjust the pH or something. Even if you've got a supplement that you would normally use for silica, for example, you can add a little bit of that and pH it, and that's enough to reduce the osmotic pressure gradient across the roots if you've got only reverse osmosis water. And if your water coming out of the tap is not really, really bad, if it's potable, if it's drinkable, it may not be ideal, but you're probably better off using that as opposed to plain unadulterated reverse osmosis water if you do need to give your plants straight water.
Or distilled water, like Kevin was saying, any pure water source, if it's been purified completely and all the impurities removed, so you're dealing with more or less pure H2O, that can cause a problem. So now we've covered water and nutrients, we've covered power.
And so in small home grows, this typically isn't a problem, but what happens if you run out of carbon dioxide? Plants need carbon dioxide to breathe. If you run out of carbon dioxide in a room that's really well sealed, it's amazing how quickly the plants will actually deplete the carbon dioxide in that room and run out. There's several easy ways of fixing this. One is go stand in the room. We're amazingly efficient at generating carbon dioxide just standing around. You start doing any physical activity, you almost double the amount of carbon dioxide you create. So just standing in the room can actually get the carbon dioxide levels up. Generally, it's not a huge problem either. If you do run out of carbon dioxide, you're not starving the plants immediately. But if it's an extended period, again, it's like running out of water. What you want to do is start shutting the plants down and not trying to get them to actively grow. You never want to push them to actively grow if you don't have everything, the water, the carbon dioxide, and the light in balance. So if you run out of carbon dioxide, I would turn the lights off. Keep watering the plants as normal. I wouldn't necessarily fertilize them extensively, but you want to keep the roots wet. You want to keep the plants happy in terms of their environment. But while you don't have carbon dioxide, there's no point in pushing them with light. It will just make them struggle. So I would turn the lights off until you can get carbon dioxide back.
So now if you're used to growing at high CO2 levels, you're never going to get that through atmospheric, but you could have either a plan in place or a way to bring in filtered air from outside to get CO2 into your grow, but you're going to be only at ambient CO2 levels, which is around 400 parts per million today, I believe. And so in that case, you could do that to move, but like Kevin said, you're not growing maybe at the 900 or 1600 parts per million anymore, so there's no need to fertilize or light them quite as heavy, and you could actually do some damage. So that's something you're going to have to know through your own grow.
And I mean, if your carbon dioxide monitor is still working, but you simply don't have a carbon dioxide tank, you ran out, it's easy to walk into your room and watch that carbon dioxide level start to climb as you're standing in the room. It doesn't deplete as quickly as you'd think, and we're very good at putting carbon dioxide out. So in general, the easiest way to mitigate running out of carbon dioxide is literally to just go stand in your room for a bit and keep checking on it. It'll probably take care of itself by the time you get more carbon dioxide delivered.
So does that cover all of our major bases? I think we've covered power and light. We've covered environment. We've covered nutrients and the gas, the CO2.
And there's always equipment breakdown. So you may have perfect power supply, but your air conditioner just failed. So as the temperature starts going up in your room, what can you do about it? Again, the first thing I would do is kill the lights. The lights are providing heat to the room. They're pushing the plants. The plants can tolerate high temperatures without light, much better than they can tolerate high temperatures with light. So first thing to do is kill the lights. You may, in veg, not kill all of the lights. Again, you only need to keep the plants awake, but you can kill the lights and string by without an HVAC system for a very long time. In a cold climate, it's important to keep things from freezing. And that's where if you do lose a heater, for example, in a greenhouse or in your house, the light in your grow will actually help warm it up. So you want to keep the light on if you're worried about things getting too cold. But if you're worried about things turning too hot because you lost your air conditioning, turn off lights.
That's a good point. So even if you have power, things can break. And one of the good things you should spend time looking at when you're setting up or designing your facility is looking for single points of failure. So for example, you have a, $100,000 computer system and you're, strewing around sensors and everything around your grow. But if you have a little 12-volt power supply that goes out, that can be a problem for your entire facility, whereas all your risk mitigation, all you needed to do there was have an extra power supply on hand. Now, you might not want to duplicate the entire computer system and have a duplicated $100,000 system, but it's probably in your best interest to spend an extra $15 and buy that power supply if those things break. And it's good to know computers might not break as easily, but certain things as you experience them, power supplies being one, they do wear out over time. They're guaranteed to break at some point. It's just a question of how long. And so if you can look around your grow for things that would take out major systems or cause major problems, but wouldn't cost much or take up much space to have a backup of those, it's definitely worth looking at having a backup of those systems.
So, for example, if you're running hydroponics, having extra pumps on hand is a no-brainer. That's usually relatively cheap. They're usually relatively to install, and they do break on a somewhat regular basis. And it's almost never when you plan on it. It's always when you least expect it. Usually on an evening or weekend when you can't just run to the store and get another pump. So it's very important, if you have a larger scale hydroponic system, I would have replacement pump parts, and it's also very handy, in my experience, to have emergency plumbing supplies in terms of some of these silicone steel tapes, for example, can be used to patch up a broken water line. Will it patch it well? No, it won't. But it can get you through a weekend until you can replace the actual plumbing part that you need to replace. And it works a lot better than duct tape. So I speak from experience on this. So having some of these basic emergency plumbing supplies, if you're doing hydroponics, can also be very useful. As Noah mentioned earlier, having extra water sitting around is never a bad thing either. If you're a small home grower, having a 5-gallon bucket full of water may not be a bad idea. In fact, oftentimes I keep a 5-gallon bucket of water by one of my tents, and oftentimes if I'm pressed for time running out the door, that's what gets put on the plants at the last minute, and I don't have to bother filling it up, and it's very convenient there. It's also very convenient if, for example, you lose your water supply, or if you lose power and things are starting to get cold, you can use that water to help keep your plants warm. So, and that's an incredibly cheap insurance policy you can have. And a 5-gallon bucket with a lid on it can double as a convenient seat when you're sitting in front of your plants and doing the topping.
So again, if you're looking at your facility, whether, as we pointed out, whether it's a single small tent in your home or a giant multi-million-dollar facility, you should take some time as you're designing it, as you're building it, and even if you weren't involved in that process, if you've come in and inherited the project, you can still, as it's up and running, start to look through for single points of failure that are fairly cheap that you know are going to break. As Kevin said, pumps are a good one because moving parts will break over time. It's just the way that things work.
And because pumps are subjected to pretty much the worst environment possible, I mean, they're generally submerged in caustic or acidic solutions, and they have a tendency to break more often than other things. Fans are another thing that break on a regular basis. 20, 30 years ago, they made fans that lasted quite a long time. Our experience with most fans now is they last 6 months or so before you have to replace them. For oscillating fans. For the inline fans that we have, they actually seem to be lasting decades still. And so you might not need to have those around. However, if you've got a large facility and losing one of those inline fans means you lose one room, then it would make sense to have an extra one sitting on the shelf so that you can replace it, if possible, as soon as possible.
And this is where good design comes in. If you're working on a facility, if you can standardize on your pumps as much as possible, your inline fans, your oscillating fans. So if you want to have, if you have a pump failure, if you have one pump, you could have 2 or 3 of those on hand. If you have 40 pumps, you're probably not going to have all those on hand as backup. So when you're designing your facility, you're thinking it through these systems and setting the systems up, you should definitely consider, hey, how easy is it going to be to back up these different parts, to find these parts when I need them in the pinch on a weekend? Those are all things you should be thinking about because we are dealing with a living thing. It's not a normal factory where we can just shut it down for the weekend, walk away and say, cool, we'll deal with this on Monday. You've got living plants. If you can't fix things on a weekend, you could lose a crop and potentially an entire business. So it's worth taking some time thinking these things through and having a plan in place, whether it's equipment or just a source for the equipment.
And different particular setups require different considerations. So, for example, in a hydroponic ebb and flow setup, if you have a manually hand-operated pump, you can take over the job of the pump yourself. Is it going to be easy? No, it's a lot of pumping with your hands, but you can do it. And a manual hand-operated pump goes to Home Depot for about $10, I think. So it's a cheap, easy insurance supply, and it's also convenient sometimes when you're having to move water around. If you're running high-pressure aeroponics, it's almost impossible for you to create the pressure necessary to push the water through those little nozzles. You really do need an electrically operated pump for that. And so if you have an aeroponics setup and you're in an area which regularly loses power, I would consider getting a generator specifically to run the pump on your aeroponic system, because that's going to be the very first thing that will kill the plants, is not having water being sprayed on their roots in the event of an electrical outage.
Yeah, so those systems are much more sensitive, and that's just one more argument for, looking at maybe when you're assessing systems and how you're going to grow, looking at these aspects, not just how does it yield, how does it grow, but what happens when things fail. Everyone talks about a nozzle clogging and that when you're talking about aeroponics, but they often don't address what happens when the power goes out. And that is a concern because power can and does and will go out.
And speaking of nozzle clogging, you definitely, if you're running aeroponics, want to have extra nozzles on hand. Even if the nozzle is cleanable, you want to be able to just swap it out and then clean it rather than having to clean it under pressure of time so that you're not killing your plants.
Yeah. So we've tried to focus on our things that can kill your plants in a short period of time. There's all these other emergencies or seeming emergencies that occur daily in a grow operation that seem like emergencies, but they're not. They're things you need to fix and correct over time. But the one other emergency that I'd like to cover is, let's say you get you're running a giant grow. One of your head growers comes to you and says, I just watered this room with completely the wrong stuff, like completely the wrong nutrients, or I didn't pH it or something that could hurt it. What can you do, Kevin, to save your crop if I just watered it with completely the wrong nutrients, something that I know could either cause lockup or it could cause crop failure or anything like that? So not just a little bit of tip burn or nutrient burn, but a major kind of catastrophic nutrient event, if you want to call it that. Is there anything I can do to mitigate or deal with that once I've been told that this happened?
If you know what you watered with and you have an understanding of chemistry, it may be possible to water them with a new mixture, which could help make up for that. However, that requires a lot of detailed knowledge, and it's going to be different between every different fertilizer line out there. So it's not something that I would ever recommend. But theoretically, you could fix the problem by watering an additional set of chemicals of nutrients in. If you don't know what you are doing or you don't know what you watered with, probably the safest thing to do is immediately flush with water. And again, it's best not to flush with plain RO or distilled water. You want to mix it with something, whether it's just a simple silica solution and then pH that, or just pH the water itself. But you want to flush the plants with water as much as you possibly can to get whatever remnants of what you miswatered them with out of the soil, out of their roots, out of your hydroponic system. Get that cleared out, and then after a couple of times flushing with water, re-water them. And I'm not talking about waiting days. I'm talking about doing this all as quickly as you can. Flush as much water through as you can, and then re-water them with the correct whatever you were supposed to water them with. That's probably the safest way to handle a situation like that. And it is something that happens to even the most experienced growers all the time. When you realize, oh crap, I forgot to add this particular thing, or I forgot to pH it and I just watered my plants with pH 5 water or with pH 8 water. And it happens. And is it going to shock the plants? Yes. But the less time you can have with that dwelling on their roots and the quicker you can get it washed off and replaced with the correct stuff, the better off you are.
Great. Yeah, it's a good point. Don't feel bad. We've all done it. We'll all do it again. It's just part of what happens. You want to have those good processes in place so you can minimize those events. But they do happen. There's human error that creeps into these grows, and that's just, again, part of the joy of working on these grows. So that covers it for the major items that we want to cover today with regard to emergencies. Again, things that can affect your grow right away. We've done other topics regarding, plant issues, whether it's a disease or a pest. But again, those are problems you need to solve over time. And they should, if you're on your game, be dealt with before they even occur and be dealt with prior to the issue really cropping up, to having a true outbreak of bugs, which can become an emergency quickly if you walk in and you've got webbing on your flowers.
It can certainly feel like an emergency, and as frustrating as it is to see spider mites eating everything, they still aren't going to kill your plants in the next hour, like losing electricity with an aeroponic system will kill your plants.
Yeah. So those are the kind of disasters and emergencies, and hopefully this gave you a little food for thought for your garden and what you can do to start with a kind of disaster recovery plan, if you will, and how to deal with these disasters. Because again, they are going to happen. It's not if, it's when. So plan ahead. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So get in there and do these things before the emergency occurs and prepare yourself. So thanks for joining us for another Cultivation Cast with Black Dog LED. Noah and Kevin here. We hope you have a great time in your gardens, and happy gardening, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.